Sometime early in the morning, the boat had relocated from the quiet cove where we'd spent the night, and we woke up to gentle-ish rocking. Rough seas are just one of those unfortunate facts of life on a liveaboard. The boat crews do their best to find sheltered areas whenever they can, but you still spend a good amount of time getting tossed around. I don't actually mind a little rocking, especially at night, since I'd rather listen to the boat creak than people snoring in the next cabin. With the weather we'd hit yesterday, the boat had relocated a little further north to the Kauai region.
I've never seen any lights or anything, so it's kind of cool.
The Eagle Rock dive site is right over here, right between those two big rock features. And those rock features continue all the way down with many cool pillars and little alleyways.
I'm also lucky in that I don't usually get seasick. The one exception was Socorro, and that was pretty epic levels of chop on a very small boat. Jen usually suffers a lot more than I do, though she's just a trooper, and since finding boning, she's generally been able to manage it fairly well. I find, in general, the best solution is to get underwater where all the chop at most turns into a little bit of surge. One of the claims to fame of Raja is wobbegong sharks, which are these big, flat-looking sharks that have a whole bunch of little nodules sticking off their chin. This was the first one we saw, but by the end of the trip, they would be right up there with pygmy seahorses as far as things that we were kind of just over. The thing that will never get old to Jen and I is these massive schools of little fish hanging around. In fact, that's why we decided that our next big trip is going to be to Palau. Not unexpectedly, based on surface conditions, the current was a lot stronger. Our guide Clement was doing his best to kind of hide us behind the rocks as much as possible, but I actually handed the camera to Jen just so I could concentrate on trying to keep my air consumption down. Eventually we did find a place that was more protected so we could kind of just drift around and enjoy all the fish and coral in the shallows. We ended the dive out on this ridgeline exposed to current in the hopes that we might see a manta. Unfortunately, we didn't have any luck this time, and it did kind of make me burn through the last of my air pretty quick. This was a safety stop where we were off in the blue, aka not close to an island in the shallows where you can enjoy the coral. So there's not as much to watch, but every now and then you get something like these salps coming by. You can actually touch them and they feel like kind of firm jello. Generally, the first order of business when we got back on the boat was to eat, and then sometimes we'd go back down to our rooms to rest. We did technically have a view of the water from there, but this was what it was. These were also closed a lot of the time, since somebody walking the deck could just look right in.
We finally seem to have found a spot where we are all alone out here. No one has followed us out here yet. And our next dive site is called Black Rock, so that must be that.
Unlike some of the other boats we've been on, Clement and the crew were really good about doing current checks before we jumped in. Part of me is always a little bit surprised on just how little the fish seem to be bothered by the current. Actually, for the most part, they seem to enjoy it because it basically brings food straight up into their face. So this is a torch coral. In the aquarium hobby, I've seen one little head go for well over $100. It's always just so cool to see the big, healthy corals in nature that are bigger than anything you'd ever see in the aquarium hobby. This is a bubble coral, which is another one that we had in our reef aquarium, prior to the whole thru hiker life change. These guys are Titan triggerfish. They can get up to 30 inches long and are somewhat notorious for being randomly aggressive to divers. I've always been taught to watch out for that little fin that sticks up on the top of their head. If that goes up, get ready to get your fins between you and them because their bite can do some serious damage. Here it's probably mating behavior as they're circling each other. This is another cleaning station. The tangs are basically all lined up waiting for attention from those little cleaner wrasses you can see darting around their body. This is a ribbon eel. They're really, really cool. They've got this bright yellow and blue coloration to them. They do tend to stand with their mouths open like that, just waiting for something to come by they can feed on. They can be a little shy to actually get a good shot of them on video. The first time we came to Indonesia, Jen couldn't wait to see pygmy seahorses. They are these tiny, less than 2 centimeter long guys. They live their entire life on these fans down deep. The pictures from people with, $8,000+ cameras look super cute, but in person you're generally just staring at something tiny that just kind of sits there and blends in with the surrounding. This was the trip where we saw so many we were officially over the whole pygmy seahorse thing. So far, this had been a really cool dive in an area known for really cool dives, so it hadn't really stood out. Then we came onto this ridge that just was infested with tens of thousands of anthias. It's hard to capture on the GoPro just how it feels to be in the middle of that many fish all moving around, eating and flashing and going about their existences. We could have sat here for hours without getting bored. Our best guess was they were attracted to this particular ridgeline at this particular time because of the way the current was kind of breaking over the top. But of course, Jen still had enough attention to capture these clownfish, which are hanging out in a bubble tip anemone. There were actually some sharks that were hanging out over the top of the ridge. The currents were a little funky, so we had to be careful looking over, and it was kind of hard to capture the sharks behind, you know, all the thousands of other fish. In fact, Jen was so distracted by all the fish going all over, I don't think she even saw the sharks. The ridge was also covered with these really cool bright yellow button corals. It was just hard to appreciate considering, you know, all the fish. I seriously could have just stayed at this spot for hours. Sadly, as I've mentioned before, current isn't overly conducive to stretching out your tank gas. This is the boat's charging station. Basically anything that needs to be recharged is supposed to be plugged in up here where people will see if it catches on fire. And when diving, there are a lot of things that have to be plugged in pretty constantly. In addition to filming more, this is the trip where I also got Jen doing color correction on the footage. I found a phone app called C-Reel, which seems to be the most straightforward way to add some red back into underwater footage.
And it's got kind of a little pointy nose as long as it's a...
We did 31 dives during this trip. Doing that many dives in a bucket list, you know, trip of a lifetime sort of location, you tend to form a preference for certain types of dives. Personally, while I enjoyed them all, the wall dives like this were the least interesting to me. Partially, I think it's due to the fact that we like making videos, and the small things that you find on a wall like this are harder to capture with our basic-ish GoPro setup. And also, similar to how I feel about being out in the outdoors during my thru hikes, I just love the wide-angle aspect of being out there surrounded by nature, and I get that a lot more in the shallows where the lighting is good and there's a lot more life going on versus, you know, down deep in the gloom investigating crevices. So, still fun, just not my favorite. Also, since generally all 4 of our groups and occasionally some from surrounding boats would be working our way up and down the wall at different depths, it often felt a little more claustrophobic. But hey, there were pygmy seahorses. Lots and lots of pygmy seahorses. To everybody that calls me a pessimist, I will point to the fact that I kept trying to capture these little guys on a GoPro. Here the visibility was obviously kind of limited, but if you're someplace like Socorro with really clear water, you do get a little bit more of a sense of that scale of being on this giant wall just flying over a big drop.
this angle. It's really easy to tell there's two big fat boats parked right in the middle of our nighttime. Yay.
These two boats were some sort of a private charter that apparently has a history of acting illegally. Here they were tied up on shore, which is a big no-no in this area, where you're required to anchor at least in 90 feet of water to prevent reef damage. We found out they basically dropped the anchor at 90 feet and then shoved the boats into the shore and refused to move even after multiple cruise directors went over to talk to them. Sadly, this is why rules have to exist. As a result of this, and because the boats were parked right on the night dive site, both of the boat crews decided we would drop right in the middle of the charters to make a point. This was a night dive, but we started before the sun was down. Personally, I kind of like starting after dark better since more things are out, but it can be fun to witness the transition as all the day-active species head for cover and the predators start cruising around. We have the opposite of a fancy camera rig. It's a GoPro with some decently mounted lights, but I've never been overly happy with our nighttime footage. I usually do my best, try and capture just a few things, and then spend the rest of the time just enjoying whatever small weird critters we see. These are a bunch of little fish that are using this sea urchin as protection. It's always just one of those really cool things I love watching. Normally things look like this, with everybody crowding around whatever the latest cool little feature people found, and other groups queuing up behind. Then when a camera person like us gets there, the floodlights come on and it kind of changes everything. This crab actually has anemones that it puts on its shell and uses as defense. They'll actually move the anemones from shell to shell as they get bigger. Eventually, the dive was over and it was time to surface, get back to the ship, take a very much appreciated hot shower because even 80-degree water can feel cold after a while, and then settle down for dinner and crash, basically, the moment we were done eating.